Holt and Daly, in their book History of the Sudan from Coming of Islam to the Present Day, point out that on 8th July 1965, northern troops at Juba went on a rampage that left hundreds dead and a whole section of the town in ashes. The Juba and Wau incident sparked a new exodus of Southerners into neighboring states, where tens of thousands settled in refugee camps. The Anyanya responded with atrocities of their own. Government control was soon limited to the major towns and heavily fortified posts, and elsewhere ceased to exist, to be replaced in some areas by rudimentary Anyanya administration. While this story is corroborated by authors such as Edgar Oblans in his book, Sudan, Civil War and Terrorism, Malakal, one of the three major towns in southern Sudan, was omitted from record. Malakal, like Juba and Wau, was subjected to the same violence. Thus, the violence unleashed on the three southern Sudanese towns occurred successfully within the period of 1 week. Locally in Khartoum, the Vigilant newspaper, which was the mouthpiece of the Southern Front Party, edited by its Secretary General, Mr. Bona Malwal Madut Ring, reported the incident to its readers. The word diaspora comes from Greek language, meaning scattering. It refers to the dispersion of people from their homeland. Historically, the initial use of the term diaspora refers to the dispersal of the Jewish/Hebrew people. Around the First World War, the term became associated with the Armenian diaspora who fled from Turkey. Again, during the Second World War, it reverted to the Jews. In the 1970s, the word diaspora began to be applied to various social groups around the world. Some of the causes contributing to mass movement of people include political, economic, and environmental factors. There are many definitions of the word diaspora, all relating to scattering of people, or movement of people, or flight of people for safety purposes. I prefer Professor Paul Gilroy's definition in his paper, Diaspora and Details of Identity, because it is rich with understanding and nuances. Gilroy defines diaspora as a network of people is scattered in a process of non-voluntary displacement, usually created by violence or under threat of violence or death. Diaspora consciousness highlights the tensions between common bonds created by shared origins and other ties arising from the process of dispersal, and the obligations to remember a life prior to flight or kidnap. Therefore, the violence meted on the Southern Sudanese by the Sudan government on the second week of July 1965 falls within the definition of diaspora. This was the first act of violence by the Sudan government that gave birth to the Southern Sudan diaspora. This was followed by two further events in 1983 with emergence of Sudan People's Liberation Movement Army, and in 1989 with the coup of General Omar Hassan al-Bashir. Holt and Daly write that the Juba incident sparked a new exodus. Thousands of Southern Sudanese fled to Central African Republic, Zaire, now called Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia. The experience of Southern Sudanese in refugee camps in the mentioned countries largely is undocumented, but it is orally narrated and shared with the communities. Common themes that came up from the oral stories relate to isolations, feeling of insecurity, language barriers, discrimination, traumas, negative labeling, and belittling languages. restrictions on movement, and so on and so forth. Many of the Southern Sudanese who fled the country, composed of junior and secondary school students, government officials, and ordinary people from the countryside. In their new countries of safety, the Southern Sudanese refugees worked on tilling plots of land allocated to them to produce food for self-sufficiency and for sale. With all the difficulties of being in foreign land, the refugees continued to struggle for freedom by supporting the Anyanya movement in different ways. For example, they contributed food and money. The refugee camps became centers for raising consciousness and support for the resistance. Anyanya fighters frequent the camps to see their families and also share information about the struggle. For Southern Sudanese who fled to northern Sudan and resettled in Khartoum, they found themselves living in poorer areas such as Ishesh due to meager resources, and also the fact that most of Southern Sudanese by that time educationally did not have any qualification and they could not manage to get good jobs. In spite of the tough conditions of living, discrimination, religious and racial abuse, for example, the use of the word on seeing a black person like me, the word ya up or ya abit was commonplace, and poor employment opportunities. Southern Sudanese contributed monthly to their preferred parties. Some donated to Southern Front parties and others donated to SANU, and all Southern Sudanese believed in liberating South Sudan from the Sudan. 7 years later, in 1972, the May 25th regime of General Jafar Mohammed Nimeri struck a deal with the Anyanya Liberation Movement, granting the southern region of the Sudan a regional autonomy. The agreement triggered the return of the refugees from the settlement camps in the neighboring countries. The dream to return home, harbored in exile, which is a feeling experienced by most people uprooted violently from their homelands, on this occasion became a reality. So these people were able to return after the agreement. Unlike refugees, economic migrants are motivated by the wish to improve their lives. For them, home is an option that is readily available for them to return to. Most economic migrants go abroad to make money in order to implement or realize their own projects at home. Claire Mercer et al., in their book, Development and African Diaspora, Place and the Politics of Home, argue that Africa diaspora earned resources for combating poverty back home. So this group is completely different from political refugees, though they are also part of the diaspora. Over 90% of Southern Sudanese repatriated home from 1972 with the support of international community. While the Addis Ababa Agreement of 1972 was to a large extent embraced by people of Southern Sudan, a minority group, including politicians such as Egre Jardin, Gordon Murtat, opposed to it vehemently. Some of these opponents of the peace agreement made their way to Europe, where they took refuge. This became the seeds of Southern Sudanese diaspora in Europe, later on to play a crucial role in the struggle. Unfortunately, the regional government fell in the hands of self-serving leaders whose main objective was to promote themselves using tribalism at the expense of the well-being of the people of Southern Sudan. They allowed themselves to be used by the May 25th regime to divide the people of Southern Sudan. This led to fracture of the unity of the people who once viewed themselves as one people in a struggle against Khartoum system. So the unity of the diaspora from 1965 to 1972 as a result fractured. When Southern Sudan weakened by divisions, General Jafar Nimeri in 1983 seized the opportunity and he repealed the Addis Ababa Agreement. And at the same time, he Islamized the Sudan. He decreed Sharia law in full. This alarmed the people of Southern Sudan because effectively they have been reduced to second-class citizens in their own country. The whole of 1983 marked an important period in the contemporary history of the Sudan. It is the year in which Southern Sudanese unity fractured under the weight of tribalism. It is the year in which Addis Ababa Agreement of 1972 was repealed. It is the year Sudan became an Islamic country. It is the year SPLA was born, and it is the year in which the second scattering of the Southern Sudanese people happened. With Islamization of the country and the rebellion in Southern Sudan, the security forces resorted to repressive tactics targeting Southern Sudanese politicians, local traders, students, and so on. Southern Sudanese began to flee to the neighboring countries and beyond for their safety, with many others flocking to the capital city where security was much better in a hostile environment. This sparked massive movement of Southern Sudanese to places like Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Europe. In Europe, London, due to its history as a colonial power in the Sudan, became a place of preference for Southern Sudanese. A good number of Southern Sudanese from the other countries in Europe, such as the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, France, and so on, relocated to UK. In addition to the already existing community in place, which was built by the opponents of the repealed Addis Ababa Agreement of 1972, the Southern Sudanese students on scholarships in UK could not return home. This led to the majority of them applying for political asylum. This group, after securing recognition, brought their family members under the family reunion rules to the UK. What is life like for Southern Sudanese refugees on arrival in London? Southern Sudanese who came to the UK have varied life experiences. The main concern is about safety and security of the person. Once in the UK, the first thing that had to be overcome was immigration regulations and accommodation. The newcomer begins to make connections, and here the community became crucial in terms of local knowledge and support around finding solicitors and directions to local authorities with issues of accommodation and social security. Sudan Relief and Rehabilitation Association and Sudan Christian Fellowship, these two main Southern Sudanese organizations based in London, supported the newcomers. These organizations, among others, played a big role in networking with local politicians, churches, and the public. They mobilized support for the cause of Southern Sudan. They arranged for interested British people to visit and see for themselves the refugee camps in the neighboring countries, including visits to the liberated areas. So Europeans were able to interact with Southern Sudanese back in the refugee camps and in the so-called liberated areas at the time. The Sudan Christian Fellowship linked up with churches in America, spreading the news about development in Sudan and the persecution of Christians under the Islamists. It served as a mobilizer of Southern Sudanese worldwide by connecting Southern Sudanese diaspora in America, Europe, Australia, and on the ground with Sudan Council of Churches. Stephen Vertovik, in his article, The Political Importance of Diaspora, points out that political interest and activities within diaspora group is normal, and it plays a role in influencing views in the host country as well as supporting resistance at home. This has been made simpler with the advent of social media. As these organizations and individuals played a big role in welcoming newcomers and supporting them, the hard time that comes after initial stages is associated with the issue of employment. The right to employment is not automatic, and as the newcomer waits for determination of his or her immigration status, the lack of employment and staying at home day in and day out create a depressive environment. This led to issues of domestic violence spiraling within the community, as men in most cases did not want to change. They stuck to their ways, and this was a serious problem leading to breakup of families. So here we have a cultural clash. We come into a place whereby the culture is completely different and the adjustment is not easy. And so it has also played negatively in terms of keeping families together or keeping families and children uh, under one roof. So the process of adjustment, adaptation, and settlement is not easy. It involves the cultural clash, it involves the will to change, and it involves the will to acknowledge the realities of life in the new environment. Coming from conservative culture, where women are expected not to challenge men, is a big problem for most Southern Sudanese men. From experience, when the Home Office grants leave to remain or refugee status, the second hurdle becomes employment. No matter what qualification one has, it is always a problem to secure employment commensurate with one's qualification. So people are forced to do menial jobs in security sector, cleaning sector, and so on. The literature on diaspora attribute this in Europe or in the West or in Europe as a whole to marginalization and issues of racism. However, equally, white Eastern Europeans, to a certain extent, also equally experience problem of employment. In diaspora, marginalization is part of life. Nevertheless, people work hard always, splitting earnings to support relatives back home in Africa. The obligation to ensure survival of relatives and continuity of extended family stems from Africa's belief in a community, as opposed to the individualism in the West. Diasporans also support their political organizations of choice financially as a way to ensure the dream to return home. It could be argued that diasporans, from the individual to their organization, are deeply involved in resistance to oppressive regimes or oppressive structures that have pushed them out of their lands. Without the Southern Sudanese diaspora, it is arguable that South Sudan would never have attained independence. The influence of the diaspora in mobilizing and enlightening local people, the people back home, using social media, working with local politicians and churches, played a significant role in putting the case of South Sudan in the White House. Unfortunately, the hard-earned sovereignty of South Sudan, similar to what happened in the 70s, fell in the wrong hands. The independence of South Sudan has produced a brutal dictatorship, aided by South Sudanese who returned home from the diaspora. One would have thought that they knew better, but life is full of surprises. Therefore, South Sudan diaspora divisions widened, and it would be wrong to presume that South Sudan diaspora is homogeneous, but it is rather safer to say it is multifaceted, involving varied experiences in the process. Uh, this is where I end up. But I would just like to say that the diaspora, the Southern Sudanese diaspora, have played a negative role in South Sudan. Most of them who went occupied very important position in South Sudan, but they have not managed the country well, and they have become more destructive than actually people who were in Africa and had not come to the diaspora. Such is life. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Elhaj.